Oh my God. Ali Velshi. He's got a book. He wrote a book, Small Acts of Courage. I didn't know you were writing a book, but I love your new book. Congratulations. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me here, my friend. It's always good to talk to you. And there might be a couple things in the book that you don't yet know about me.
Oh my gosh, there's so much that I didn't know about you. I mean, I don't know exactly where to start. I guess the thing that I learned that I don't know what you mean by when you say I can't swim. Like, does that mean if you were in deep water, you would drown? You could tread water.
I could tread water. Yeah. I live in Manhattan. I live across from the JCC, and there's a big pool there, and you can actually see it from my apartment. So some years ago, I enrolled in summer in adult group swim lessons, which was just an interesting little mix of people. It didn't really get me far, but I can actually tread water. But given that, I can't. My great grandfather jumped off the front of a ship and swam to land. That's not something I can do.
We learn in this book how much better your forefathers were than you, and that you basically were born into so much more privilege than your father, grandfather, and great grandfather, who you trace back. And I'm not busting your chops. I mean, that's what you say.
So, I mean, my great grandparents had been prosperous in India at one point. They were affected, as many Indians were, by the droughts of the 1800s, and needed to leave the country to try and find fortune somewhere else. And they ended up in South Africa, which was, hard to believe that was better than what they left, because South Africa was this deeply racist enterprise. And everyone in my family worked harder, was not born into basic things like the right to vote, basic things like living in an independent country with justice for all. And I was born into a family in a democracy. I was born in Kenya. We moved to Canada. I grew up in a democracy. I thought these battles were sort of ancient family stories that were behind us, only to find out that, like my father, like my grandfather, my grandmother, like my great grandparents, I too am in this struggle for democracy, just in a different way.
And you are leading in so many ways with your program and with all your reporting, and of course with this book. Why did you want to write this book? How would you describe it? I would describe it as part memoir, part history book, part, I guess, just setting the table for, as you just said, where we are at now, and how that history, which you visit and learn about yourself in this book, we are kind of revisiting in America today.
Yeah. And I think, mostly I just like it to be a good read. So I sort of lean into the memoir that almost feels a bit like a novel. But if you're looking for a message, there's one in there. And fundamentally, it is that no matter how frustrating or overwhelming it might seem that America and the world can be going in the wrong direction, you can do the things that are in front of you. And that's what my family's history is about. People who did the thing that was in front of them, that may have finished doing that thing and may have ended their lives not thinking that they had achieved the success that they had set out to achieve, or that anything had changed. And yet, well beyond their lifespan, they influenced other people to change. So my grandfather died before I was born. All he wanted was slightly better rights for people who were not white in South Africa. He had no dream that his family would actually grow up in a democracy, that his son would become a member of parliament, that his daughter-in-law and granddaughter would both be candidates for major office, that his grandson would be me. They weren't thinking about that stuff. They were thinking about fixing the thing in front of them. And even that, it didn't look like it was working. So that's my point, is it's meant to be inspirational. It's meant to say, don't worry if you don't appear to be able to fix the world. You can fix something.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like when I'm reading it, especially at the end, when you talk about what it all means, it's very personal to the reader, saying, someone like me, obviously, who is desperate to make a difference every day, to contribute, to fight, to be a part of a movement, of something. If you do a little thing, you might not win. You might not see
Correct.
The promised land, the end, but you're giving something, hopefully, if you have kids, to your kids.
That's right.
They'll get more. There'll be more in the fight. Eventually, it will come to fruition, as it has for your dad, for you, for your sister, right?
And hopefully for our kids and those who come after us, who can look back at the early 2020s and say that, they were fighting for democracy. It was, believe it or not, American democracy was imperiled for a little while. Believe it or not, Ukraine was, almost taken over by Russia. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and you don't know what changes you can make, but you might only be making change by influencing people, by giving them a way of thinking about it, by looking at you and being a role model and saying, hey, that's what Pete's doing. So I think it's more important than we think. As things become more overwhelming, and they do. Look, I work in the news business. I talk to people who watch me who say, I can't take it. I can't listen to all this stuff. I'm worried about the future of our country. Or conversely, people who tune it out, Pete, because it's too much to follow. We don't
Yeah.
have those options, right? I was born into citizenship as a series of rights. And over the last several years, I have learned that citizenship is equally a series of responsibilities. And our responsibilities are to uphold our democracy, to uphold one another, and to recognize that if things aren't fair for all of us, then they're not fair for any of us. We don't enjoy democracy unless everyone enjoys democracy. So this is our fight. But I'm trying to present that in a way that is very, very easy to digest.
It's so good. It's so easy to digest. I couldn't put the book down. I'm really enjoying it. It's a different read for me than probably most people because you and I have known each other for such a long time, and we've been, I think, good friends and mutual respect, and we've been through some stuff together. And to see and learn all this stuff about you that I didn't know was that much more fascinating, including the fact that apparently you have more passports than Jason Bourne. Take us through.
It's so loud. Like, when I wrote that, I was thinking to myself, is that legal? Like, can I say that? But I do. Yeah.
Take us through your timeline. Born in Kenya and moved to Canada and then obviously to the US.
Yep. So my family is from India and then South Africa, but I didn't show up on the scene until they were in their third country in Kenya. So I was born, but I left at the age of 1, and hence didn't have Kenyan citizenship. I got Canadian citizenship very quickly. I had a Canadian passport, and then after apartheid ended, they gave my family South African citizenship because they didn't enjoy those benefits as non-whites in South Africa. So I got a South African passport. Then Kenya decided that it wasn't going to be grumpy about people having other citizenship. So if you were born there, you could have your citizenship there too. So I thought that'd be fun. Why not? And that left only India, which I wasn't looking for, but back in the day, it's gotten easier now, but back in the day, if you needed to travel to India, as I did for business from time to time, very, very hard to get a visa. So I was sitting with the consul general one day, and I said, why is it so hard to get a visa? And she said, you should get one of those overseas citizenship of India passports. And I said, well, I'm not looking for another citizenship. She said, but it'll make the visa process much easier. So I got that too. So I'm at 5 now.
And you
and America, by the way, obviously that's included in.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to pick up on that. You come to the U.S., you're living and working in the U.S. at CNN with our former colleague Ashley Banfield. You walk into her office and tell me a little bit about that discussion. She really scolded you.
Yeah, so she's Canadian as well. She had taken American citizenship, and she asked me, why haven't you done it? And the real answer was because it's forms and applications, and they needed information that I just didn't have any motivation to do. So I said to her, well, I don't.
And you didn't just quickly, and you didn't need to do it. Like, you had a job.
Yeah,
you had.
Correct. I had a green card. I worked for CNN. Didn't need it for anything. And so I joked with her. I said, well, I can avoid jury duty. And she just lit into me. She said, that's a responsibility of citizenship. You don't get to just enjoy the fruits of it and not the responsibilities. Not, I don't think she's a legal analyst, so I think she takes jury duty very seriously. But I'm not sure the point was just jury duty. It's that you live here. You are part of this society. You're in it. You have to be a full participant, and that might mean attending jury duty. But get your damn citizenship and pretend that you actually are part of this whole thing. And I came to terms with the fact that taking American citizenship did not mean denying my Canadian heritage, which has meant a lot to me and my upbringing. So I'm happily a citizen of both countries.
In reading the book, I realized that what your effort was here, and we could talk about why you wanted to do it, but to trace back your lineage. And it made me realize how comfortable and selfish I am in terms of, I don't know much about my grandparents, much less my grandparents. And I think I've always defended that in that I don't need to. I've always thought about like those 23 and me or whatever the bullshit is. Like, who cares? I don't care what my DNA is. And everybody who does, don't get offended. I think it's great, fine, for whatever reason. But in reading your book, it really made me curious about what efforts my grandparents put in, my great grandparents put in, what they went through, because I do believe in interconnectedness and that we're all connected. And
Yes.
certainly we're connected and we're here literally because of our grandparents and great grandparents. So tell people why it's so meaningful. I mean, I guess it's an easy and obvious question, but why was it so meaningful to you? I mean, your was it great grandfather?
Yeah.
He hung out with Gandhi, for goodness sake.
Yeah. My grandfather was Gandhi's youngest student. So there's two parts to this. First of all, there's a universality to the story. Whether or not my grandfather was Gandhi's student, everybody's grandparents have an interesting story, right? Everybody did something. Everybody left a place for a reason, and it's never as easy as it looks. Right? Leaving your home for another country where in those days, all you had was letters and newspaper articles. You weren't really sure, right? Everything looked like the streets were paved in gold, but you didn't know. And when you get to a new place, and you don't have friends and you can't speak the language, and it's not an internet world back then. So that's a universal story. Everybody who's from this country, generally speaking, is from somewhere else. And we are all intrigued by what we can find out about our ancestors. The second part of this, though, is the story of immigration. It is the way of the world. It has always been the way of the world. It will continue to be the way of the world. We will need it in this country. We are desperate for it. In fact, the reason my parents got to Canada is because Canada realized in 1968 how desperate it was for immigrants and how was it going to compete with the United Kingdom at the time and the USA to get those immigrants. Well, we are still the top destination for immigrants in the country, but we're doing a lot of work to wreck that, Pete. We're spreading the word that we're anti-immigrant and possibly racist. I don't believe that to be true in any case. I just don't believe most Americans see immigration that way. We certainly are not an economy that's anti-immigrant because we need these folks. Right. But I just want everybody to remember, it was the same stuff back then. Those people came to countries where they were not welcomed for the color of their skin. They were told they don't speak the language, they don't understand the culture, they're going to wreck the place. They were probably thought to commit more crimes than the native-born population. Not true then, not true here in America either. So it's a little bit of a treatise both to immigration and the way Canada looks at these things. That's a little bit differently than the U.S., right? I was at an event in Toronto for the public library the other day, and they were raising money for all the ways in which they could welcome new arrivals to Toronto. Literally, the public library, financial services, financial training, housing services, education training, language services. Canada's sitting there and everybody's taking it on themselves to say, a lot of immigrants, we need all these immigrants. How do we make them feel at home so that they can become like my family did? I want America to think that way before we lose the edge that we've got right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we think about Canada, and we don't know much, most of us don't. And we think of, we know it's, about what, as many people as there are in California alone, like 30 million or something.
That, yeah.
And then, but at the same time, it probably, I don't know how much more land or more. The point is, you have this really funny, not anecdote, you're talking about a cartoon that you saw years ago, describing the anti-immigrant feelings in Canada. What I'm trying to say is, even though Canada doesn't have as many people, it does have a lot of land. It still has, as every country does, an anti-xenophobia, if you will. Tell us about that cartoon.
So it was very young, and my dad was showing it to me. It was in the newspaper, and it was a husband and wife on the porch of their farmhouse in, I think it was Saskatchewan or something like that, where there's nothing but land, and they're looking out, and literally it's their farmhouse, and they're looking out on nothing but land. And the subtext about immigration is, where will we put them all? Right? It was the cartoonist was making fun of the idea that we have nothing but land for these people. In fact, Canada has the largest diaspora of Ukrainians anywhere in the world, because Canada has the same kind of wheat that they grow in Ukraine, and they didn't have people to farm it, and it was. It's unpleasant to live in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the winter. And these Ukrainians are like, hey, we got this. We know how to do it. So, they came, they worked hard, they did something that was necessary. And yes, we had the space for them. And yes, we still have space. Now, what we don't have, Pete, anywhere in the world, in London, in Vancouver, in New York, in San Francisco, is adequate housing. But for most of the last 150 years, we haven't had adequate housing, irrespective of immigration. We just don't build enough housing, and certainly not enough affordable housing. That somebody tweeted the other day and told me, these immigrants are causing a housing crisis. Like, no, we have a housing crisis. We've always had a housing crisis. No. Immigrants are not causing it. We have an infrastructure problem that we need to fix. So even Canada's got that. Even Toronto and Vancouver struggle with prices that go up, rental prices and property prices that go up because people come in from other parts of the world. That's the normal course of things. Our job as a society is to say, we need a lot of immigrants, which means we need a lot of housing. We need proper roads. We need proper public transportation. We need proper services. We need financial services. We need to teach people English. But that's us. We provide the infrastructure. These beautiful people come here and provide their labor and our future.
Well said. I'm not so I'm not anti-immigrant. I'm anti-migrant is the joke I like to make, because there's a big difference between what it means to be immigrating, become a migrant or a refugee or any number of other statuses. And we're only going to see more migration, people being forced out of where they live. I think we think of that word and we think of like flocks of geese or tribal people moving as the seasons move or as the buffalo roam, following them along. But the truth is people are going to come not only to the US, but other countries all over as a result, obviously, of climate. And as you know, more than as well as anybody, war, because you've reported so much from Ukraine.
Climate, war, and economics. That's it. Those are the three reasons. By the way, historically, Pete, they're the three reasons everybody's ever moved anywhere anyway, right? Maybe it wasn't a full-on climate change, but it was drought in my grandparents left India because of drought. And by the way, because when the British colonized India, India was almost a quarter of the world's GDP. It was a massive, massive economy. And then it shrunk down to about 2% under colonialization because the Brits took all the stuff of value, made it in Britain and sold it back. So when drought hit India, it was unable to sustain itself, which is why everybody left. That's why there's an Indian diaspora. That's why in any major city you go to, there's an Indian community. That's why the West Indies has Indian communities in Jamaica and Trinidad and places like that. But everybody always left for a better life, a safer life, a better economic life, or food, or education. It's the same stuff, and we have to think about it that way. But some people in this country have taken to using derogatory terms about migrants, which is people who move. I mean, an immigrant, a migrant, as you said, a refugee, an asylum seeker. They are all coming for different reasons, but they are what we built this country on. And you can have beef about our policies. You can have beef about whether or not we should have a more solid door on the southern border. This is all legitimate conversation, but we are dehumanizing them. And we have been doing this for not just the last decade. Both political parties have not done a good job of this. I mean, I argue for the fact that immigration in this country should be handled by something called the Department of Immigration, or something that that understands the economic imperative of immigrants. Ours is under the Department of Homeland Security. The whole concept of immigration is shrouded in a context of threat in America. We have to get out of that. Immigrants are not a threat. They are going to save our economy.
In the last 20 years, it hasn't been both parties, to say that, to be fair, right?
You are right. Historically, both parties have not been as aggressive about fixing, creating a proper streamline for immigration into the United States. In the last 10 years, the Republican Party, which, by the way, used to understand in places like Texas and Florida the economic imperative of immigration, to this day, decided that they would lean into this anti-immigrant stuff. And it predated Donald Trump. He just tapped into a rich vein. My old colleague Lou Dobbs, our old colleague at CNN, leaned into this very, very heavily. It's just wrong. It's just economically wrong. You can not like immigrants if you want. I don't know why you live in America then, or certainly not in an American city. That's your choice. But it's wrong to suggest that it's economically bad for us, that it lowers wages or does something bad for us. Yes, we've got housing crisis. Yes, we've got traffic and transportation crises. Fix those.
It just made me laugh thinking about Lou Dobbs. He was such a nice guy off air. He's really kind, and I always liked him, but I got into a real argument with him about immigration in the green room one time. This is now at Fox News, and I just remember him like yelling, like, "My wife is Mexican," or something like that to me. And I just yelled back, "You own a horse farm, sir." Like, he was so wealthy. He had like a horse farm in New Jersey, but it was always the, I'm friends with the blank. Right. We always love the people of the ethnicities that we know personally. And then we use it to defend how open-minded we are. Like, I'm not sexist. I married a woman.
Yeah.
Anyway, you go into the history. Let's do it. Let's look at some of it. Man, I learned so much about South Africa and Kenya specifically, and India, that I didn't know, and Islam. And then I learned about your weird, somewhat sad-sounding childhood in Canada, where you couldn't play hockey and you didn't get to eat ham sandwiches. We'll get to that because that's kind of fun. You turned into a badass, though. At some point, you rode a motorcycle across.
Yeah.
You were riding a motor. I mean, I've always thought you were a pretty cool guy. So I love the idea that you weren't when you were a little Canadian brown boy who couldn't play hockey. But let's talk about your grandparents. Let's talk about. I mean, I guess probably you just mentioned India, but talk to me about South Africa and how your family ended up there first. I think that was before Kenya, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So when you were leaving India in the 1800s because of these droughts, you went where the boats took you. If you were on the east coast of India, you went to Hong Kong or Malaysia or places like that. If you were on the west coast of India, which my parents were in Gujarat, you went to Bombay and you got on the boats that left from there. And they went, generally speaking, to Africa. So my parents went to, my great grandparents went to South Africa, where my grandparents on both sides were born. And they tried to just sort of eke out a living. I always thought they were business people. What I didn't realize until I researched the book is that their business was that they bought hand carts, like wheelbarrows basically, and one would fill it with vegetables and one would fill it with household goods and things like that, and they'd go door to door and sell that stuff. And eventually they consolidated it all and they became slightly more prosperous. They had a gas station and they bought a bakery and things like that in Pretoria. It's like a little ghetto. They all lived 1 square mile sort of thing. And then they were Gujaratis from this part of India called Gujarat. And they had a Gujarati accountant who did their books. Well, that accountant also did some work for this new lawyer who had come to South Africa named Mohandas Gandhi, also a Gujarati. So that's how my great-grandfather and Gandhi got to know each other. And when Gandhi would come to Pretoria, he was living in Johannesburg. When he would come to Pretoria, that's where the government was for his negotiations with the people who in the government. My great-grandfather would supply him with a horse-drawn wagon because he was one of the only people in town who had one. It was called a dray. And they just became friends. He would stay at my great-grandfather's house, and that was it. There was nothing. I don't think they talked much politics. And then Gandhi asked my great-grandfather, would he allow his son, my grandfather, to attend his ashram that he was building. He was building a commune. My grandfather was 7 years old at the time. And my great-grandfather's only response to Gandhi was that we're Muslims, you're Hindu. How can I send my son to live at your residential school? And Gandhi says, I will learn your religion to teach it to him, which he did. So my grandfather learned Islam from a devout Hindu, from Mahatma Gandhi.
That is crazy. I learned about Judaism from my father, and he didn't know anything about it. So I didn't learn much, but not at all similar. Actually, I don't think my dad ever even mentioned the word. So how do you get to Kenya?
Well, so Gandhi leaves South Africa eventually, and my grandfather sort of takes what he learned on this farm. He was there for 3 years as a boy, and tried to work that into his daily life, the fighting the little injustices. And as they got more prosperous, they started fighting greater injustices. So my dad's brother went off to train as a guerrilla and went to sort of all the communist capitals to learn how to fight off apartheid. And slowly but surely, the government was getting annoyed by my parents' involvement in apartheid and forced them out of business. It's a good story in the book, but they needed to go somewhere. They were essentially stateless in their own country, which is what it was like to not be white in South Africa. You didn't enjoy basic rights. So they were off to Kenya. My dad had 2 sisters who had married husbands who were in Kenya. So we had some roots there, and they were going to try and replicate their lives in Kenya. And that's what they did. They moved to Kenya before it was an independent country, while it was still a colony. They got to see for the first time in their lives the birth of a country, the birth of a democracy. They got to participate and vote in their first election. And actually, life was pretty good in Kenya. They were there for 10 years until I was born. Apparently, I wrecked the whole thing.
What happened? How did you wreck the whole thing?
I didn't actually wreck it. One of the things that happened in Africa, where Indians were in all of these countries, and in some cases they were really helpful to the cause, as Gandhi was, and others. In other cases, they weren't. They were somewhere between the native black people and the colonizing white people, and many of them wanted to be closer up to the white people and farther from the black people. And so when black nationalism came to Africa, as it should have in the days when colonialism was ending, there was a sense that there were slogans that said things like Africa for Africans. And India, meanwhile, had told these Indians, you're not Indians. You haven't been here for a long time, so you're not coming back to India. So Indians weren't sure what their place was in African society, and it was starting to get hostile. And that culminated in in the early 70s in Uganda with Idi Amin expelling all of the Asians from Uganda. So it felt like that was going to move to Kenya as well. So my parents moved to Canada, where they were finally able to sort of realize democracy in its fullest form.
It's fair to say the Indian diaspora is as large as any other ethnicity. It's a very populated country, but I think China and India, I feel like your people are everywhere.
Everywhere, literally, yeah, and for different reasons. And you will, I mean, you will run into Chinese business people or laborers around the world, same as India. In India, it was both laborers. They were there, brought in by the British to lay the railways, generally speaking, or work the mines or things like that. Or they were small business people, like my grandparents and great grandparents were, like small business people. They would have a shop. The typical word for an Indian is dukawala, somebody who owns a duka, which is a shop. They're shopkeepers, which created some of the antagonism with the native African groups, because while the British colonials and European businesses controlled economic activity in Africa, it's not what the person from the village saw. They saw the shop run by an Indian, right? Generally, when you're feeling displaced in life, you mostly look at whoever's the one who looks like they're holding up your advancement, the next person up the rung on the ladder. And that was in many cases the Indians, who were professionals or shopkeepers. And that's what made, and look, a lot of Indians stayed in Africa to this day and have made it work. Durban in South Africa remains the biggest population of Indians anywhere outside of India to this day.
Oh.
So a lot of people did stay and make it work, but my parents were on such a quest for a fully participatory democracy, and that's how they ended up in Canada.
And then I think Canada is next.
Yes.
Yeah. So what happened? How did
So
they
we get
come?
to Canada, we get very involved in politics right off the top.
Your mom and dad moved to Canada. You and your sister are born already? I mean,
I'm 1.5 when we get there.
My sister. You're only 1.5. Okay.
Yeah, wow. Yeah. I was a little baby. We get to Canada. My mother had worked
as a baby. Did you look exactly what you look like now?
There. My family gets there. My mother had worked for KLM as a reservation agent in South Africa. So they in Kenya. So they had no other than being business people, they had no particular skill. So they opened a travel agency, and they worked really hard. But in all their spare time, they were involved in community activities and politics. They wanted to live and breathe and eat politics. And by the way, that meant watching the national news every night on TV, which is how I got into the news, because news was really important in my house, because you couldn't understand the world and politics if you didn't consume news. And they tried out all the political parties. They found themselves to be liberals, a party that supported workers, but not to the exclusion of business, and was business friendly, but not to the exclusion of workers' rights. That was fundamentally what it was back in the day.
Oh, interesting.
And by the time I was 11 years old, 1981, my dad called a bunch of friends together. I remember sitting in the living room. I was on the floor, and he said he was going to run for office. And they thought that was the craziest thing ever. Canada at the time was provincial. It was not a place where a guy like my dad, a new immigrant, little brown man, was going to run for office. But he did. He ran for office. He ran in a constituency as a liberal that had been conservative for 42 years. The incumbent was the health minister. Now, in Canada, the health minister is like the attorney general, because it's a universal health care nation. And in those places, the health minister is a very, very important person. So he's running against like the most solid guy out of 100 seats that were up for election. So we get in the car on election night. We'd gone home to change. I'm 11 years old. I'm sitting in the car with my dad. We put the radio on. It's 8 o'clock, and they announced the polls are closed across the province. Too early to tell what the results will be, except for in this one constituency, which my dad was running in, where they were able to say that the incumbent conservative had been reelected, because it was such a certainty that would happen. Nobody even needed to see a vote. I couldn't believe it. I'm sitting in the car, and I look at my dad. I can't believe we lost. And he says, "Of course we lost." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "We were always going to lose." And I said, "Well, why did we run if we were going to lose?" And he says, "Because you can." Because I was able to put my ideas out there, and people could vote for me. And fewer people voted for me than voted for the other guy. And tomorrow everything goes on the same as it used to be. Nobody gets arrested. Nobody goes to jail. and life goes on. And we arrive at the campaign office. Everybody claps for my dad. I'm wondering what they're clapping for because we just lost the election.
Yeah.
But he had done what they wanted him to do. He went into the back room. He phoned the guy who won the election, had a charming conversation for a minute. He conceded the election. There was no challenging it and audits and all that kind of stuff. And we went on. And that's where I learned about politics. And the funny part is people who've read the book or know my family say, but the story is that he ran again and he won and he became the first. But that wasn't as important to me as when he lost. When he lost is when I learned what politics was about and why you run for office and how you lose and what you do. When he won, we just got more votes than the other guy.
Tell me just a little bit more about your boyhood in Canada, because you go into that and it's, like I said, it's a little bit heartbreaking thinking about how my friend was bullied. But I mean, you called yourself husky. You were a fat boy because you ate donuts. And
Yeah. No, I'm very glad there wasn't social media when I was growing up, because I really would have felt badly about myself and all the things I wasn't getting invited to. But look, it wasn't a bad childhood by any means. I just wasn't engaged in the things that somebody like me would have been engaged in as a child. Now, for instance, every immigrant now plays hockey, and they do the same things. And unlike me, where I was sort of embarrassed to take my sort of Indian leftover foods, to school for lunch while everybody was having ham and cheese sandwiches. Now, people go into school with their fully ethnic names and make sure everybody else can pronounce them. They go in with their food, or they don't, right? It's everybody's choice as to what you want to do. You don't have to do things to fit in today the way I had to. But I don't have regrets about it. I had a great childhood. Canada was a great and welcoming place. I just didn't do some of the things that were as Canadian as I perhaps would have liked to, but turned out okay.
Your dad was seems like a real good guy. He's always supporting other people, and you would get donuts delivered, and you would apparently be allowed to eat as many as you want. And then we learned that you can freeze donuts. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I didn't understand why we got 2 dozen donuts every Saturday morning. Because you don't question some things, Pete. If somebody shows up with 2 dozen hot donuts at your place every Saturday morning, which we can't eat, my mother's giving donuts up and down the street, then we're freezing them and you put them in the microwave. It's fantastic. I didn't know until much later that the man bringing us the donuts owned a donut shop, and as an added service, he would come and deliver donuts to people. You paid him for it. He was a refugee from Uganda. And we got our groceries the same way. Back before there were grocery delivery services, we'd open the door and there'd be groceries in bags. A man would go, he would buy groceries. He would use the public transit system, the buses, to come and give us our groceries. Again, my parents were supporting these refugees who had no other way of doing it. Both of those families, by the way, turned out to be very successful, because that's what happens. You come as a refugee to these countries, right. You have nowhere to look back on. This is your future and your children's future. You work hard and it tends to work. And by the way, you try not to because you get deported.
Yeah, that man was Arthur Bezos, Jeff's dad.
Similar to that, right? But that's the thing. We were, and that's, I didn't realize this was all part of the ethos. And I think about it today, right? Because we do the same thing. We just don't know them. We get our food delivered by people who are also have come here from somewhere else and maybe don't speak the language. We do that. So I remember that when it's time to tip. And I don't think of immigration as an abstraction, right? I think of all these people around me, and I wonder what my life would be like here in Manhattan if those people didn't choose to come here and be among me and my neighbors. And I wonder what their grandchildren will write about them one day. So it's a really, to me, that's the thing we have to think about, that we are all, I mean, I'm an optimistic guy generally, Pete. The last few years has challenged me, but I am an optimistic guy. And those stories reminded me that when you do right by others, things do work out.
I remember when we met, I was super curious about this guy. Like, how did he get here? You were I believe the chief business correspondent for CNN. And the more I got to know you, the more I got to know, I think, your personal opinions and proclivities and ideas, but they didn't come out on air, certainly not at CNN, not until much later. And we can talk about that evolution of yours. But didn't you go to business school and want to go into business? How did you end up in journalism and media?
Well, funny enough, I wanted to be a lawyer. I'm not sure I wanted to be a lawyer, but that was what I was going to do. And as I was in school, in college, I started to get more interested in activism and news and things like that. And I didn't want to go to law school in the end. I decided I wanted to write, but I couldn't get a job at a newspaper. And ultimately, I did get an internship at CNN. Took me 10 years after my internship to get back to CNN as an employee. My parents were not thrilled by that. They're pretty forward looking, but they're still Indian parents who, it's like, you can be a doctor, you can be a lawyer, and a couple other things you can do, but this journalist thing doesn't really, like, does it pay, and you're going to make your rent and all that. So I didn't study business. I became a business journalist because my family had been in business. I figured I'd know something about it. And at the time that I came of age in the business journalism was growing, right? CNBC was around, Bloomberg was around. So Canada wanted to launch a similar station like that had a screen that had, stock tickers and all that kind of stuff. And I said, look, I don't really know much about business. I'm familiar with it through my parents, but not trading in stocks. And they said, we'll give you a really good producer and an earpiece, and you do what the producer tells you. And that's how I got started. I really followed other people's scripts and instructions, and then I came to love it. I came to really enjoy the world of business. And boy, had I stuck with that, Pete, what a simple life I'd have. I mean, now I'm in it. Now I'm in all this political.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad that you evolved from, the anchor of CNN's Your Money, chief business correspondent, to Al Jazeera. I remember that time for you. And then obviously doing the best work of your career, I think you would agree, at MSNBC, according to all of your viewers, I'm guessing. And that's certainly how I feel. Do you have the book on you?
I don't actually.
Son of a bitch. I wanted you to read something.
Well, hold on. It's within reach. So let me.
Yeah, go ahead and get it.
Here we go. Okay, got it right here. All right. What would you like me to read?
At the end, page 274, I wanted to end our conversation with that. It's if you start at what is the biggest risk right at the top and end with, at the bottom of the page, they always do, and I can edit that, whatever. Would you mind?
Yeah, no, I'd love that.
I really love this, and I think it's a great way to kind of, recap or just look ahead.
What is the biggest risk that I can take? And am I taking it? What is the most revolutionary thing that I can do? And am I doing it? Will I pass on to my children, Erica and Eli, the same inheritance of good choices and positive actions that was passed on to me? I don't think I'll ever be called on to take a blind leap into the Indian Ocean, which becomes a huge relief since I still don't know how to swim. But for me, as a journalist, the most radical and revolutionary thing I can do is simply to use the platform that I'm so incredibly lucky to have. I can resolve to make journalism and the national dialogue better than they have been. I can promise to never again let go of my aspiration to be Webb Miller on that phone outside the Darasana Salt Works, using my camera to bear witness to injustice and using my microphone to hold power to account. But you don't have to be a television journalist to make a difference in this world. You don't have to be Mohandas Gandhi or Nelson Mandela or Pierre Trudeau or Barack Obama to do it either. You can be a refugee on a boat. You can be an immigrant shopkeeper struggling to get by. You can be a working parent with barely 5 minutes to spare at the end of the week. All you have to do is make the greatest contribution you can make, given what you have at that moment. Maybe it's running for local office, or maybe it's helping drive people to the polls. Maybe it's volunteering at the library. It can be anything. Your efforts may feel like a drop in the ocean. It may feel like change is impossible. Your actions may not even bear fruit until your children, your grandchildren, or your great-grandchildren come of age. But somehow, somewhere, your choices will leave their mark. They always
do. Man. So good. The whole book is so good. Everybody should go buy it. But before you go, I just want to say to you, we met in 2010, and you role modeled how to behave in the TV news business to me, because you were an on-air person. Everywhere you went in the building, in the hallways, and even then on the streets, people recognized you. They knew who you were. But you treat then and now everybody the same, no matter who they are, whether they're the executive above you or the, quote, maintenance person, quote, below you. You treated me that way. Nobody else did. I stepped in that CNN, which is very serious, hard news, as a comedian trying to evolve like you had, apparently. And you treated me like one of your own with respect. And it made me feel smart. It made me feel like I had something to say and it was worth hearing. And everybody that's ever worked with you knows that about you. That's who you are. That's how you treat people. And this book colored and informed me as to why my friend is the way he is, because of his parents and his grandparents and everything else. So I just, I wanted to say that, and thank you for joining me over these years and for being my friend, and congratulations on this book. It's so important, and your kids will value it as will theirs and mine. Thank you, my friend.
And to you, my friend, I've appreciated our long friendship, and may we have many more years of it.
All right, bud.